Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Harvard Classics lectures. This is volume number 10, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Now the actual title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, is the more elongated title. Now we're going to turn to a text that some of you will initially think, really, why should I kind of waste my time with a text like this? I mean, I get it, the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid or a few of the other texts of the Harvard Classics we've already done, but why this one? And why is it that Dr. Eliot, the creator of the Harvard Classics, chose to put this now in the series? I hope that we can answer some of those questions as we go along. The first thing, though, I want you to put in your notes is the date. The date this text was published is important, 1776. Of course, as American readers of this text, we're going to appreciate the irony, right, that a great English economic philosopher is going to publish this text in this year. And when we get to the very end of this text, we're going to hear maybe a couple of observations by Smith that suggest that, you know what, coming in the future, there may be some issues for England, economically speaking. Now, let's just review where we've been up to this point in the first 9 volumes of our study in the Harvard Classics. Again, all of these lectures posted at learnstrong.net. If you haven't been following our stuff, you might want to hit that down that left-hand side. Just find the Harvard Classics folder and you can find our stuff. In Volume 1, we did Ben Franklin's autobiography. Again, note our date here, 1776. And Woolman and Penn. In Volume 2, we did Plato's Dialogues. In Volume 3, we did Bacon's Essays. This was our first British scholar of the Harvard Classics. We also did Milton's Prose in Volume 3 and Brown's Religio Medici. Then in Volume 4, we did Milton's poetry, especially Paradise Lost. We gave individual lectures over every one of the books of Paradise Lost, as well as Paradise Regained. Right? And again, this was our first poet, technically speaking, right? The 34th Harvard Classic lecture. In Volume 5, we did lectures 35 through 55. These are the essays of Emerson, America's greatest, maybe, prose stylist of them all. In Volume 6, we did the Poems and Songs of Burns, lecture 56. We want to remind ourselves, for your notes right away, that Adams is another Scot, so we'll have met two already. In Volume 7, lectures 57, this is St. Augustine's Confessions, maybe the most influential text so far, who's to say, right? I make that argument that it is a very influential text. In Volume 8, we do the Greek dramas, lectures 59 through 68, and the four great playwrights. Okay. In Volume 9, we did, at lecture 69, we did Cicero and Pliny, the two great Roman thinkers. And now we turn to a work of economic philosophy, and in Volume 11, we turn to Darwin's Origin of Species, that great text of biological study and philosophy. Now, Dr. Eliot, the creator of the Harvard Classics, must have been aware of what he was doing by putting these two texts side by side. In many ways, they are transformative texts. Let's put those in our notes. Transformative, by that we mean the following. These are texts which have tremendous ripple effect after the fact. I'm hoping that from our study of Wealth of Nations and then later our study of Origin of Species, you'll get a sense of why that's the case. Now, let's, as we've done in our previous lectures, let's do a real quick brief summary of life and ideas, and then we'll summarize this amazing work of, really it is, philosophy and economics. And I also want to point out at level 2B that there's a real powerful prose here as well. Adam Smith was a great writer on top of the fact he was an amazing thinker. Let's divide his life up into some into some phases, beginning with early years. He's born the 5th of June, 1723. Really, that's the date of his baptism in the Church of Scotland and Kilkenny of Scotland. His father dies before his birth, and he's raised by an amazing mother. Let's put that in our notes because we've seen this. Several of our major thinkers in our time together in 303 raised by a powerful mother and a woman figure in their life. He attended good schools from 1729 to 1737. His education at the University of Glasgow, he arrives at 14, kind of like Bacon and Milton. He's a prodigy early on. He studies philosophy with Francis Hutcheson. really influenced by Hutchinson to embrace issues of liberty, reason, free speech, and the like. We're going to hear him, in fact, comment on the American colonies and especially on the use of slavery, and he's going to argue that he has real problems with it. He doesn't think that it will ultimately work long term. In 1740, he goes to Oxford, and he's unimpressed, actually, with the instruction at Oxford after having spent time with Francis Hutchinson. And he even comments on this in Book 5 of Wealth of Nations, that he found it not very useful. His teaching career begins in 1748 at Edinburgh. He will begin talking about economics. In 1750, an important year, he meets David Hume, the other great Scottish intellectual, and although 10 years older than Smith, they form a friendship, and together many have argued the Scottish Enlightenment will begin here. In 1751, he becomes professor at Glasgow University. He's the head of moral philosophy for 13 years there. His books, 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, is kind of a collection of his Glasgow lectures, and he emphasizes the importance of empathy. Okay, now that's an interesting idea, but the notion is that humans have this special capacity to empathize. We go back in our study to the Greek dramaticists in Aristotle's Poetics to say something similar, don't we, right? 1763, he becomes a tutor to Henry Scott. He travels, he goes to France, he meets Ben Franklin. That will be significant. In 1766 to 1776, he works on Wealth of Nations, and it is an instant success when it's published in 1776. The end of his life, 14 years later, July 1790, he is disappointed that his life has not gone as well as he thought that it should go. That he didn't achieve enough. That will remind us of our comments on Milton, won't it? Right? We've noticed this about a number of our writers, haven't we? That they just never seem to be sufficiently impressed with the work they've done. What is it that Da Vinci said on his deathbed? I've wasted my days. Some of us will say he did more in a day than most humans do in a whole lifetime. Smith is in many ways similar. And when you pick up Wealth of Nations, and let's say out loud, we're going to treat this, as I'll say it a little bit later, at the epidermal level. It's a long text and it's a complicated text, but I'm hoping that I will invite you to read it. That's my hope. Well, let's talk about Wealth of Nations really quickly in a brief summary. Again, published the 9th of March, 1776. The table of contents will tell us a whole lot. I love the kind of table of contents that we'll see both in Wealth of Nations as well as in Darwin's Origin of Species. We'll say the same thing. Go through the table of contents. Note, our treatment here, again, as we've said, is only going to be at the epidermal level, and we're going to apologize in advance to all of our economics people out there. We are not going to give this text the treatment that it deserves. It's been given that treatment by economics and economic theorists elsewhere. We'll be looking at this, though, as an important influential text of philosophy and economic philosophic inquiry, no question. It is a product, let's put this in our notes, of 17 years of study, 10 years actual writing, right? It's divided up into 5 books with individual chapters, and this Harvard Classics volume is in fact somewhat edited, as will be mentioned in the introductory comments of the volume itself. Now, let's work through each of the 5 books, briefly summarize Smith's ideas, enjoy a few of the amazing lines of prose, and we're going to remind as well you of our learning theory as we're going through this process. Let's remind ourselves that we're always trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Now, a whole lot of what Smith has said in Wealth of Nations by economists today is kind of debunked. And they say, yeah, okay, it made sense for 1776, but we're in a different time, in a different place. A lot of what Smith has to say, I think, still has some serious relevancy when he gets at the end of this thing to talking about the problem with debt load for a nation and the fact that all of the major European powers, including England, are going to succumb to serious debt problems, and that will be their ruin. We look at some of the events that today, of course, are happening, and we're familiar with the debate that really began in many ways with Smith. Now, of course, our 3 levels of reading will follow this. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, here we'll look at specifically Smith in 2 ways. We're going to see Smith as a remarkably cosmopolitan writer. He's not just British. He gives examples from all over the place. antiquity, no question. He's always talking about the Romans and the Greeks, but also he'll talk about China, he'll talk about Africa, he'll talk about all of the different nations of Europe, and he'll reference them as if the reader is supposed to kind of know something about all of those different kind of countries and nations. To that degree, he's very erudite, but very cosmopolitan. Okay? Number two, we're going to look at the word pictures. So, for example, he's going to have an idea about how economics works within a wealthy country and the invisible hand, as he'll call it, which is a really interesting word picture. We're going to see a lot of these word pictures. Finally, at level 3, we'll ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? The Harvard classics are classics, not because Dr. Eliot many years ago said that they were, but in my estimation, they're only classics if they benefit you in some way. So we'll look and ask questions about what are some of the texts that we can relate to at 3A, and then finally, how can I relate to this information personally? Okay, let's now go quickly through. I'm just going to give you a summary of each of the different sections, and then maybe turn to a few of the lines that I enjoy the most and enjoy reading out loud. First of all, there's the introduction and the plan of the work, as Smith will call it. And the question will be right away, what is wealth and what is a wealthy nation? And we're going to be stunned, some of the ironies. For example, Smith is going to argue, you're not wealthy because you have money. I mean, if we think anything about what, for example, happened in our own American experience after the American Civil War, down in the Confederacy there, all that money that you had to load into a wheelbarrow to just get a loaf of bread, money is not the key. Wealth is different from money because, of course, wealth is what you can purchase with whatever it is, if you want to talk money or whatever, right? The number of people productively employed versus those who are not is one indicator for Smith of whether a nation is wealthy or not. And of course, the modernized countries, right? Here we'll think a little bit about the idea that he is in fact going to approach this study as a science. Now go back to some of the things that we've said before about how from about 1700, remember in 1776 here, we talk about that differentiation of the value spheres. That the three value spheres of arts, morals, and science were controlled in many ways by the church up and right until the scientific Enlightenment. Adam Smith is definitely a part of that. So as arts, morals, and science begin to pull away, differentiate, and become their own spheres of influence, the science field for Smith deserves to consider economics. And so he says in his introduction right away, this is his chief concern. We'll turn right away in the early words just to get a sense of Smith, because we want to let Smith do some of his talking for himself. Among the savage nations of hunters and fishers, every individual who's able to work is more or less employed in useful labor and endeavors to provide, as well as he can, the necessaries and conveniences of life for himself or such as his family or tribe as are either too old or too young or too infirm to go a-hunting and fishing. By the way, Smith is constantly thinking about those who have, but also those who do not have, and the ways in which those who do not have need to have some sense of compassion provided, economically speaking, and of course incentive to give them some sense of work, right? Such nations, however, are so miserably poor that from mere want, they are frequently reduced, or at least think themselves reduced, to the necessity sometimes of directly destroying and sometimes of abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted with lingering diseases to perish with hunger or to be devoured by wild beasts. Among civilized and thriving nations, on the contrary, though, a great number of people do not labor at all, many of whom consume the produce of 10 times, frequently 100 times more labor than the greater part of those who work. Yet the produce of the whole labor of the society is so great that all are often abundantly supplied, and a workman, even of the lowest and poorest order, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessities and conveniences of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. Notice the use of the word savage here several times. That is to say non-European. We're going to see this kind of referencing several times. Finally, he finishes his introduction by saying this. Nations, tolerably well advanced as to skill, dexterity, judgment in the application of labor, have followed very different plans of the general conduct or direction of it, and those plans have not all been equally favorable to the greatness of its produce. The policy of some nations has given extraordinary encouragement to the industry of the country, that of others to the industry of towns. There will be a debate in in Wealth of Nations about the town versus the country. We'll come back to it. We of course here in Worland live in a very agrarian community, so we're familiar with this tension already. Scarce any nation has dwelt equally and impartially with every sort of industry. Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, let's put it in our notes now, the other great text of 1776, other than obviously the Declaration of Independence, is Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And here it will be referenced, although not directly. We'll know that in fact as we read this text, that standing behind Wealth of Nations is Gibbon's classic, which published in the same year, argued that there were specific scientific reasons why the great empire of Rome fell. Now, of course, we read that today and kind of chuckle because we know Rome never actually fell. It just actually transformed, didn't it, into the next phase that became Europe, right? Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, the policy of Europe has been more favorable to arts, manufactures, and commerce, the industry of towns, than to agriculture, the industry of the country. So there is a tension that Smith will be playing with. The circumstances which seem to have introduced and established this policy are explained in the third book. So we'll begin right away then with the question of the role of government. What role does government play in the tension between agriculture on the one hand, that is to say out in the country, and manufacture and production, that is to say the town or the city? Nations are wealthy in relationship to the dance between the two. And let's go ahead and say it out loud. Right now, you can put it in your notes. Smith is huge on agriculture. He is a firm believer that agriculture is the way that nations thrive. However, you have to have production within the city and manufacturing. Remember, of course, this is the beginning of that time we call the Industrial Revolution. It will only begin to grow exponentially, which is, I think, one of the reasons that this book becomes such a powerful read, an influential read going forward. The basic argument then is this. Things work out when there is free trade, right? And government basically stays out of the way as much as possible. We're going to hear about this invisible or this hidden hand idea, right? And to that degree, when government allows for free trade, it's a whole lot better than lots and lots of regulations. Okay. Now we're going to see though that Smith is not a believer in complete unregulated trade. He's going to argue, for example, that you need to have public institutions like schools that are properly funded, or you cannot really have a wealthy nation because you have to have an educated group of people who are especially aware of how to intentionally manipulate economic policy, right? And so we'll get into it. All right, let's jump to Book 1, 11 chapters. We'll go quickly now through them in the introduction. The intro of Book 1 asks, what counts as the wealth of nations? And he asks this question, why do modernized countries, industrial revolution, machines and all of that, technology we say, why do technologies and modernized countries produce wealth better? And again, right away, his questions, I think, are important ones for us. I mean, what we just read gives us some sense that this is kind of where he's headed, right? Okay? That is to say, let's put it in our notes now. Back to our Plato lectures, there's two ways to approach anything. One is random, and the other, of course, is intentional. And Smith is going to argue that what makes nations wealthy is their intentional application of economic policy. Now, what will that look like? Well, obviously, that's the whole point of Wealth of Nations itself as a text, okay? Book 1, Chapter 1 will begin. He has this interesting title of the causes of improvement in the productive power of labor and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. And then chapter 1 will begin with the division of labor. So right away we begin with the division of labor. We have specialized people for specialized tasks. For example, pen makers, right? You can have a single individual trying to make a pen, or you can have a whole bunch of people trying to work making different parts of that pen, the metal that will be required. Again, notice at 2b, our word pictures already will begin, right? He says that one individual is obviously much less efficient than a whole group of people who are specialized and trained to make parts of the pen. And that, for Smith, right away is the key. In developed nations, he'll argue, the poor are better off than the rich of many undeveloped nations. I'll turn to a couple of passages really quickly. The division of labor, he says this. The division of labor, however, so far as it can be introduced, occasions in every art a proportionate increase of the productive powers of the labor. The separation of different trades and employments from one another seems to have taken place in consequence of this advantage. This separation, too, is generally carried furthest in those countries which enjoy the highest degree of industry and improvement, which is the work of one man in a rude state of society being generally that of several in an improved one. In other words, when we work together, we are much better than when we work alone. This great increase, he continues a little later, this great increase to the quality of work, which in consequence of the division of labor, the same number of people are capable of performing, is owing to three different circumstances. First, to the increase of dexterity in every particular workman. Secondly, to the saving of the time which is commonly lost in passing from one species of work to another. And lastly, to the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor and enable one man to do the work of many. It's not that Smith is giddy about the Industrial Revolution because he recognizes the problems when machines start, for example, replacing workers. But he will say it is an inevitability, and therefore wise nations know how to manipulate intentionally the machines to aid their growth and their wealth. Chapter 2 will begin for us of the principles of the principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. That is to say, open trade. Let's put this in our notes because he's huge on this one. Even more important than division of labor. You got to have trade. You got to have trade for a nation to grow. Under developed countries, they're suspicious more of trading with other countries, and they begin to regulate in some ways. The opening lines, this division of labor, from which so many advantages are derived, is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Now, he's going to make the argument that this is fundamental